The silence between the notes of a Pink Floyd record often speaks louder than the lyrics themselves, but for decades the world focused on the wrong kind of silence, the one that occurred after the band famously splintered. We have all heard the standard narrative. Egos collided, lawsuits flew, and brothers-in-arms became sworn enemies over the rights to a name. But what if the true death of Pink Floyd didn't happen in a courtroom in the 1980s, or even when Roger Waters walked away? What if the band had effectively ceased to exist as a creative unit years before the public ever suspected? This is the story of an internal erosion that transformed one of history's greatest musical brotherhoods into a collection of isolated individuals, hiding their personal tragedies behind a wall of global success. To understand the decay, we have to look at the genesis of their transformation. In the mid-1960s, the band was a playground for the psychedelic imagination of Syd Barrett. It was raw, unrefined, and deeply collaborative. When Barrett's mental health plummeted, the band didn't just lose a guitarist, they lost the primary architect of their identity. The arrival of David Gilmour brought a necessary stability, but it also fundamentally shifted the power dynamic. As the band climbed toward the stratosphere of fame with the success of The Dark Side of the Moon, the very mechanisms that made them successful began to quietly dismantle the intimacy required to keep a band together. The challenge wasn't failing. The challenge was handling the weight of being the biggest band on the planet. Roger Waters, once a quiet art student, began to evolve into a creative monolith. Success provided a platform, but it also acted as a magnifying glass for his growing need for control. While the music reached unprecedented heights, the emotional baseline of the group was shifting toward a cold, professional efficiency. Waters has famously suggested that Wish You Were Here was the last time the band functioned as a true, unified emotional entity. It is a haunting thought that while they were recording what many consider their masterpiece, the members were already drifting into their own private orbits. The music was a tribute to a lost friend, but the subtext was a eulogy for the band itself, written while they were still in the room. The emotional void grew wider with each passing project. During the sessions for Animals, the collaborative spirit that defined their early years was replaced by a rigid hierarchy. Waters was no longer just a songwriter, he was a director, and the other members were becoming performers in his play. From his vantage point, he was simply picking up the slack, driven by a fear that the band would lose its edge if he didn't steer the ship. From the perspective of Gilmour and the others, however, the environment felt increasingly suffocating. They weren't being asked for their input, they were being instructed to execute a vision they didn't fully own. By the time the machinery of the wall was in motion, the tension was no longer a secret kept behind studio glass, it was the atmosphere of the room. This album represented the peak of Waters' creative dominance. Every lyric, every narrative arc, and every conceptual theme was an extension of his own psyche. While David Gilmour's contributions to tracks like Run Like Hell remained vital, they felt more like guest appearances in a broader, singular narrative. The producer, Bob Ezrin, became the primary mediator, essentially becoming the only person Waters could truly communicate with as an equal. The band members were physically present, but they were no longer a collective force. The most controversial and painful chapter of this collapse centered on keyboardist Richard Wright. Waters viewed Wright as a symptom of a larger problem, a lack of creative drive. He felt that Wright had checked out long before the recording sessions started, leading to a confrontation that would permanently shatter the band's trust. Waters demanded Wright's departure, and in a moment of intense pressure, Wright complied. Even though he continued to work on tour as a paid professional, the internal damage was absolute. For many, this was the moment the soul of Pink Floyd was officially evicted from the building. Waters has long maintained that this was a necessary evolution and that the public's outrage missed the point. The band was already gone. He argued that the split was a reality of the studio, not a sudden event. However, this interpretation ignores the human cost. For Wright, the experience was a profound betrayal, and for the remaining members it signaled that no one was safe from the leader's dissatisfaction. While the wall went on to achieve legendary status, the victory felt hollow. It was an album about isolation, recorded by a group that had perfected the art of being isolated from one another. The creation of the song Comfortably Numb serves as a perfect metaphor for this era. Waters' inspiration was rooted in a literal experience of medical detachment, a doctor injecting him before a show to manage a severe illness. He performed in a state of physical and mental distance, a feeling that eventually became the emotional anchor for one of their most celebrated tracks. This was the irony of Pink Floyd's peak. They were mining their own misery and emotional deadness to create art that connected with millions, even as they felt less and less connected to their own lives and each other. The friction between Gilmour and Waters regarding the emotional tone of their music could no longer be smoothed over. Gilmour sought a balance of melody and atmospheric depth, while Waters was obsessed with raw, jagged, and often painful political and personal themes. These creative differences had existed since the band's formation, but as the stakes rose, they became irreconcilable. The studio transformed into a battlefield where every decision was a negotiation, and every negotiation was an opportunity for resentment to take root. As we look back at this period, it becomes clear that the success of Pink Floyd was also its undoing. They had reached the summit of the music industry, and once there, they found no further mountains to climb, only the exhaustion of maintaining the view. The brotherhood that sustained them in the underground clubs of London couldn't survive the transition into global icons. They were no longer four friends making noise in a basement. They were a corporation of personalities, each trapped by the expectation of greatness and the weight of their own history. The final nail in the coffin was the final cut. If the wall showed the cracks in the foundation, the final cut was the structure being demolished. At this stage, the democratic process of a band had effectively vanished. The album was, by all accounts, a Roger Waters solo project that happened to be released under the Pink Floyd banner. His preoccupation with the death of his father in World War II, combined with his biting political commentary, dominated every second of the tape. There was no room left for the signature textures that Gilmour or Mason provided in the past. David Gilmour later described the sessions for this album as a form of torture. He was constantly struggling against the inclusion of material that had been rejected during the Wall sessions, leading to endless, draining arguments about creative merit. The environment had become so toxic that Gilmour eventually pulled back from his production roles entirely, simply to escape the cycle of conflict. The joy of discovery which once defined their music-making had been replaced by a bitter, grueling endurance test that left everyone involved feeling hollow. Nick Mason, the band's heartbeat, observed the decline from his drum kit with a sense of quiet resignation. He noted that the atmosphere had turned cold and hostile, with members often avoiding each other entirely outside of scheduled studio time. There was no dialogue, no shared creative sparks, just the mechanics of finishing a project that no one seemed to genuinely enjoy anymore. It is a sobering look at how a group capable of creating such expansive, beautiful soundscapes could become so trapped in a small, suffocating reality of their own making. When the album was released, it performed reasonably well, but the reception was tempered compared to the cultural monoliths of their past. The magic for many felt like it had finally run out. Waters was convinced that he had been carrying the creative burden alone for years, while Gilmour and Mason felt their contributions were being systematically erased. This fundamental disagreement on who was Pink Floyd became the primary obstacle to any future collaboration. The truth, perhaps, is that they were all right and they were all wrong. The official split in 1985 was the inevitable conclusion to a long, slow-motion accident. Waters believed the band couldn't possibly survive without his vision, and he viewed the decision of Gilmour and Mason to carry on under the Pink Floyd name as a form of sacrilege. To him, the name was not just a brand, it was a soul that he had cultivated. Watching his former bandmates move forward felt like a betrayal of the history they shared, turning the final years of the group into a bitter, litigious feud that dominated rock headlines. The ensuing legal battles were some of the ugliest in the industry, stripping away the mystery of the band to reveal the cold, hard reality of trademark law. While the dust eventually settled and Gilmour and Mason continued as Pink Floyd, with Wright eventually returning to the fold, the damage to the band's internal narrative was done. For the fans, it was a time of choosing sides in a war that felt personal. For the musicians, it was a long, painful divorce that would take decades to even partially heal. The ensuing legal battles were some of the ugliest in the industry, stripping away the mystery of the band to reveal the cold, hard reality of trademark law. While the dust eventually settled and Gilmour and Mason continued as Pink Floyd, with Wright eventually returning to the fold, the damage to the band's internal narrative was done. For the fans, it was a time of choosing sides in a war that felt personal. For the musicians, it was a long, painful divorce that would take decades to even partially heal. Years later, an older, more reflective Roger Waters began to show cracks in his own hardened exterior. He started to admit that he had been difficult, defensive, and perhaps too controlling during those turbulent years. Seeing him in his 70s, speaking with a calmer perspective, one can see a man wrestling with his own legacy. He even began to joke about the realization that the audience actually loved him, a realization that, surprisingly, arrived quite late in his career. It's a tragic irony that someone who spent his life crafting stadium-filling music felt so uncomfortable in his own skin. His reflections on the soul of Pink Floyd are the most telling part of his later years. He consistently returns to Wish You Were Here as that final point of unity. It shows that despite all the accolades and the fortune, his deepest regret is not the loss of the money or the fame, but the loss of the connection. The realization that they were physically together but emotionally worlds apart is a theme that haunts his interviews to this day. It is a reminder that even the most successful artists are vulnerable to the same human failings as the rest of us. When we consider the question of why Pink Floyd fell apart, it's tempting to look for a single villain or a single moment of betrayal. But the reality is far more mundane and in many ways more depressing. It was a slow decay of trust, a gradual hardening of hearts, and an inability to adapt to the pressures of an impossible level of success. The band didn't just break, they dissolved into the atmosphere, leaving behind a legacy that continues to resonate even if the people who created it couldn't survive their own achievement. Ultimately, the story of Pink Floyd is a cautionary tale about the intersection of art and ego. It serves as a stark reminder that even when you change the course of music history, you're still a human being, susceptible to the same fears, anxieties, and miscommunications that plague every relationship. As you listen to the soaring solos of Comfortably Numb or the haunting acoustic guitar of Wish You Were Here, try to hear the human story beneath the sound. It's a story about greatness, yes, but also about the fragility of the bonds that make greatness possible in the first place.